Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for a new Ask the Pet Food Pro Chat. This series is brought to you by Pet Food Forum 2022 and the editors of Pet Food Industry, the magazine and digital content provider with decades of providing the market with pet food expertise. You can find our content at petfoodindustry.com. This series, Ask the Pet Food Pro, is a great opportunity to reach out to an industry expert, ask the questions that are most on your mind, or just listen to your peers while gathering details to help you and your company provide high quality pet food and pet treats. Today's chat is all about mycotoxins, what to expect in the coming year, best practices for testing, and other issues. This chat is generously supported by Romer Labs, so thank you very much to them. Our experts today are Christy Swoboda. Did I say that right, Christy?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. She is the Technical Services Director with Romer Labs, and we also have Randy Ford, the Chief Scientific Officer with Red Collar Pet Foods. So welcome to Christy and Randy. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Sure. Before we start the Q&A, I have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, you've all been muted to ensure everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. So please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. Some of you submitted questions beforehand, which we really appreciate, and we will try to get to as many of those today as we can, along with the ones that you're submitting now during the call. We're also trying out closed captioning for people whose first language is not English, so we hope that helps you follow along. And finally, this chat is being recorded. You can access the recording starting in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com, and then click on the Ask the Pro tab at the top. So with all of that, let's dive into the discussion. We've had a lot of questions about just the general state of mycotoxins in North America specifically, and also globally. You know, so Randy, I guess we might start with you. What are we seeing, or what have we seen in 2021? What do you think is coming in 2022 in terms of the mycotoxin risk and level overall?
Sure, thanks for that. And again, thanks to Romer for sponsoring this, and Pet Food Forum as well. Yeah, that's a broad stroke question for sure. You're always looking for aflatoxin. There's always challenges in the United States in regard to aflatoxin development due to drought, and I'm talking about most of the corn crop. There's always a significant portion of the U.S. that doesn't get enough rain in corn growing states. So there's always a challenge for aflatoxin in corn, and that's just a given every year. So you have to work with your purchasing folks in regard to buying those commodities in the lower risk areas. Also, there's always DON or Phamatoxin in corn and also in wheat. You know, it just depends on the region and the weather conditions in that region during the growing season. There's been emerging zearalenone in these past few years in corn, and then in the co-processed materials from corn, like corn gluten meal. We see zearalenone in wheat. Really high levels of zearalenone in certain parts of the country in milo. And I'm talking parts per million, not just parts per billion. And then you've always got Phamatoxin that's here and there depending on the region. And then lesser risk, the trichothecenes, T2H, and then also maybe ochratoxin. You can get that to some degree in some of these crops. And then in dealing with fruits, maybe some patulin, but those are far less widespread than the biggies, which are zearalenone, afla, and DON.
So a lot out there to worry about.
Yeah.
Do you see the situation changing any at all in the coming year, or even the next few months?
No. And as we learn more about the toxicity effects of these different mycotoxins, and even more importantly, the synergy between and among the toxins, I think the awareness and the scrutiny is going to be even greater. You know, the pet food industry has primarily been focused in on 6 mycotoxins, but as we learn more, there's going to be others that we're certainly going to want to deal with in the future as technology and labs like Christie's, as they develop better and better technology and testing capability, then we're going to want to keep on top of it.
Right. Christy, do you have anything to add?
Right. No, I would, make very similar comments, to what Randy said. When we looked recently, we summarized from a sample submission to Romer standpoint, what we had seen in the 2021 corn harvest as compared to prior years, and things such as that. And, year over year, when you talk aflatoxin, when you talk Phamatoxin, when you talk DON, more specifically, there are those regional spots of contamination that kind of occur every year. Little bits of ebb and flow regarding those levels of the toxins that we find as kind of an average. Most every year there's more localized problem areas. And for us, the one main improvement that I would say that we saw come through is some improvement in zearalenone in corn, at least from a inclusion of the amount of the zearalenone we were seeing. It was difficult from the 2020 crop to see those corn byproducts under 1,000. ppb sometimes in zearalenone, it was a struggle to get something, say, at 200 or 250. So I think that we see some improvement in the 2021 crop, but that's kind of the only comment as far as anything better that we saw analytically.
Yeah, would agree with that completely. Would agree with that completely. A year ago, the corn crop was, you couldn't find it, to your point, under 400 or 500. And this year it's been much better. But you still have your co-products that you've got to worry about. Those toxins get concentrated in corn gluten meal. So even your low levels in corn can certainly end up high levels in the co-processed materials.
And zearalenone was not really considered a risk in pet food before last year, correct?
Well, I would say it was considered a risk, but probably not as scrutinized, and we certainly didn't understand it as much. We've screened, the companies I've been with have screened for zearalenone for years and years, and you would find trace levels, but yeah, it wasn't until just 2 or 3 years ago where it really started rearing its ugly head in regard to the levels that we were seeing. And there's been a bit more knowledge about it regarding toxicity, whereas before, most of the data is on swine, and now there's more data, some of it anecdotal, but there is more data out there regarding the effects of zearalenone in pets. So as we become smarter in that regard, it becomes much more obvious as why you need to be looking for it.
Okay. So we had quite a few questions, and you gave a good list already, Brandy, but maybe you could go over a little bit more about which mycotoxins are most harmful to cats and dogs. And if I'm going to read a little bit into some of these questions, but say a company, is just getting started on being really focused on mycotoxins, or they, maybe they have a limited budget. I mean, are there the ones that they start off looking for first?
Yes, great question. And by far, I mean, it's no contest. The aflatoxin is the most dangerous one, and the only one that there's an actual FDA action limit on. So for pets, the limit is 20 parts per billion. And if you put something out there in commerce that's over 20 parts per billion, then it's against the law. And if you put something out there in commerce that's like 50 or 100 parts per billion, your phone's going to start ringing because you're going to be harming pets. So that's very obvious that's the number one. And again, the only one with the hard and fast action limit from FDA. Going down from there, you've got DON or commonly known as Phamatoxin, more of a gastric upset kind of toxin, less likely to be lethal, but can certainly cause gastric issues. and then certainly in our industry, certainly cause palatability issues. Beyond that, you've got Phamatoxin, and then T2H, and zearalenone. Zearalenone is an estrogenic toxin. At high levels can cause reproductive issues in the pets, smaller litter sizes, difficulty in conception, those types of things. So it's hard to put them in order, with the exception of the number one being aflatoxin. The pet food industry typically tests for 6. So it's afla, DON, zearalenone, Phamatoxin, ochratoxin, and T2H. Those are the big 6.
Okay. Any more on that, Christy?
No, I would agree with what he said there.
Okay. We did have a specific question just come in, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit later on storage considerations, but the question was, is T2H a storage toxin?
It can be. Yeah, it certainly can be. And by storage, we're talking about, depending on what the crop is, if it's put up wet, you can still have the growth of the various molds that can continue to produce that toxin even after harvest if the storage conditions are poor. And that goes with most of the toxins as well. Yeah. But things like aflatoxin, aflatoxin is double-edged. You can get it in the field and you can get it in storage depending on the conditions. Many of the other toxins are produced or induced by poor conditions, the wet conditions and that type of thing. But most of the toxins can certainly increase in storage if the conditions are poor.
Right, and really to add to that, really pushing the moisture content. I mean, definitely below the 15%, on grain going into storage. In some cases, you read even further than that, going down below, say, 12%. So yeah, making sure that it's harvested when dry and then stored, and continued drying is critical to really slow it down. It's hard to stop it, but it will greatly slow it.
Right, and this is where your relationship with your procurement folks and your supplier quality assurance folks comes in as being very critical in the big scheme of things of your management program. Know what conditions your commodities are being stored in. Know what conditions that they're grown in, and so on. Don't just go out there blindly. You have to do your homework before you buy 1 single pound of grain.
Okay. One question specific to aflatoxin is that, does that pose any risk to people? The question was specifically about plant workers. If they're exposed to aflatoxins, during the manufacturing processes, do they have any risk?
I'll give you my opinion. I'm not a doctor, but typically these toxins have to be ingested before the ill effects are noticed. They're not respiratory, right? They're an ingestion toxin. So in the case of aflatoxin, it ends up, the ingestion, it ends up, it's a hepatotoxin, so it affects the liver. So you could breathe in the dust from the grains and certainly have respiratory issues from the dust of the grains, but the toxins have to actually be ingested into the system.
Good to know. Good to know. We had a question come in about zearalenone specifically. If you know what level causes reproductive problems in pets?
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of work done on that. Pet Food Institute this past year recently did an extensive study on that. Again, not testing animals, but a literature search. Got to make that clear. But the proposal to FDA will be that 200 parts per billion be the limit for all pet food diets. There is some theory out there that the juvenile diets need to have a lower level. The consensus of the Pet Food Safety Committee was that that the limit could be the same for both adult and juvenile diets. And that limit will be proposed at 200 parts per billion. You can certainly have more acute toxicity when they're all known at real high levels. But from an ongoing constant exposure, it would, 200, I think, is probably going to be the limit. How long is the animal going to be exposed to the 200, and so on and so on. But that's the rule of thumb. And zearalenone is one of those that it affects different species differently. So again, this, my point of view is just from the pets. There's a lot of information out there on swine, that type of thing, where there actually is research. Not as much true research done on dogs and cats, but certainly anecdotal evidence is out there.
Right. Okay. So you just mentioned the proposed limit that we don't know if it's going to be adopted by FDA yet for zearalenone. There was another question come in, and maybe the person missed it earlier, about the limits of mycotoxins in finished product. The only one that's really on the books from a legal perspective is aflatoxin, correct?
Correct. That's the only one that has an action limit.
Okay.
DON has an advisory limit. And then I think Phamatoxin has a guidance. And those are the three categories of FDA severity, I guess is one way to put it. But like T2H, ochratoxin, patulin have no regulatory associated with them at all. And it depends on the species regarding what the limits are on those particular levels of severity.
And is there a
risk for aflatoxin? It's 20.
Okay, aflatoxin is 20. Is there a resource where people can find the different levels?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, Romer has a great reference book. I don't know if you have a copy of it there. I've got the old version. Looks like this. Got the old version, and in that there's a section on each mycotoxin. And at the end of each section, it talks about the regulatory limits. Yep. or the statute surrounding each of those different mycotoxins. And then you can certainly go on the website. Everybody on this call should have a copy of the FDA or USDA handbook on mycotoxins. You can get that right off the web. And there's a companion handbook to that USDA also that's about sampling. And everybody on this call should have both of those references in their library before they go one more day.
Good tip. Christmas presents to themselves, maybe, or holiday presents to themselves.
Put a red bow on it. It's perfect.
Well, let's go ahead. We have a lot of questions about the second reference tool we need on file. What was that one? I think the person missed it. The second.
It was the
book.
USDA Mycotoxin Handbook.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
USDA.
Oh, and someone just put in the
link.
URL in the chat box. Thank you very much,
great.
Sophie. Thanks very much. So everyone can access that. So we have had several mentions so far about testing, and we've had a lot of questions come in. And we do have some questions we'll get to later, folks, that you put in about mitigation efforts and specific ingredients. But let's talk about, what you should be doing up front before you have to get to mitigation to know what you need to do to mitigate. What are there standard testing protocols? Are there, let's pretend that someone, as I sort of gave the scenario earlier, it's a new pet food or treat company, or they're new to really trying to get a handle on mycotoxins. Where do you start with testing?
Well, the first thing I do is they need to implement a testing protocol for their incoming raw ingredients. You can look at, there's several variations of rapid test kits in the mycotoxin industry that you can utilize at the manufacturing facility for all your incoming grain. And really then from there, the approach of do we analyze for all 6 mycotoxins, or do we look at, corn versus wheat versus milo, different commodities, different based upon prevalence or the associated risk of a mycotoxin being in those grains on an incoming basis. But you definitely need to start there. There are a lot of water-based rapid test kits, that time to results is, under 15 minutes to get at least a baseline view of the grain that's coming in. And then from there, once you understand what you're seeing on a daily, weekly basis, then you can dive into the discussions of, where you're purchasing from, with your procurement partners, does anything there need to change or deviate? But testing up front is a very critical piece. We'll see if Randy has a similar opinion or a different opinion, but I don't think you can just do upfront testing. There needs to be some testing on the back end as well in your finished product once you put it through the complete manufacturing process. Oftentimes when you get to the finished product, rapid test kits aren't the most suitable. One, due to the complexity of the mixture of ingredients in the pet food, plus the variation in the formulations that are manufactured. So really, once you get into the finished pet food testing, it's more reference lab based, such as LCM, SMS methods or things such as that. One, the reference method really allows you a lower limit of detection in those complex matrices. And also just with them being complex, you ensure analytically that it's kind of the result that's most fit for purpose in that regard. So to me, you need to set up a strong incoming material protocol in conjunction with screening of finished products on the back end as well to be effective.
Yeah, agreed 100%. Especially that last point you made about the finished product testing. The companies I've worked with, we could do some screening on the finished product with rapid, but anything that you really needed to get the real answer to, you've got to use a reference method for that. And especially, if you've got something out there in the marketplace you're trying to deal with, the FDA they're not going to take a rapid test result regarding finished product. Fine on the ingredients, the individual ingredients, but you're gonna have to have reference methodology for any finished product testing.
And just so everyone on the chat is clear, by reference that you mean you send it to a third-party lab that has specialized equipment and testing methods.
HPLC, MS. The more MSs, the better.
Yes.
What does MS stand for?
Christy?
Sure, that's for mass spectrometry. Yep, when we talk rapid testing, we're talking lateral flow devices, that are a quantitative result on them. Most of them use a reader where you can quantitate that lateral flow strip. There are rapid testing options in ELISA-based test kits as well that are out there. They're not as common, but they are available. And then, on the reference side, excuse me, we get into HPLC, which is liquid chromatography, that's based in a analytical services lab, and then LCM SMS. So again, the liquid chromatography part, but mass spec. So, just a short snippet. When we're talking mass spec, we're looking at mycotoxins on a molecular weight compound basis, and we're identifying them based upon molecular weight. We're fragmenting them, we're identifying fragment patterns, things like that. So it's a very precise kind of scientific tool that goes into that confirmation of the toxin that we're looking for.
Okay. Before we get much more in depth in the testing, since we were talking about testing incoming materials, and you mentioned a lot of the grains that, which are very typical to be mycotoxin harbors. What about more novel ingredients like lentils, chickpea, ancient grains, things like that? Have those been known to have the same level or the same risk of mycotoxins as the more traditional ones used in pet foods?
Right.
Go ahead,
From what?
Christy.
Okay, I was going to say, from what we've seen, no. Typically on a year over year, those are kind of so-called cleaner, sources. One thing we watch a lot in those grains is maybe a cross-contamination of them by another grain, that can bring the mycotoxin in. We even, outside of mycotoxins, that's a topic in food allergen basis as well. But, when we get into chickpeas or fava beans or lentils or pulses like that, mycotoxins are a lot less common. And it's from what we've seen, it's more of an anomaly to find it than it is in some grains such as, Phamatoxin and corn, where it's normal. It's just, is it at a manageable level or not?
Right.
Yeah, I agreed with that 100%. And part of it's based on the plant physiology. When you look at what I call the headed grains, where you've got wheat, all the kernels are right there together on the head of the stalk. Same thing with corn. You've got all those grains all lined up on that cob. Milo, same kind of thing. And then you get into some of these other grains that you described. They're not really headed grains. They're beans or things like that. So the plant physiology doesn't promote that growth of the mold that would end up causing the toxins. But to Christy's point, based on storage conditions, you can still get, some pockets of some of these toxins, even in those things, although it would be probably an anomaly instead of routine.
Okay. Well, so getting a little bit more into the testing, and Randy, before we went live, you were telling me a little bit about, and you just referred to it, that really what you're concerned about is not the toxin, the mycotoxin itself, it's the chemical reactions. Am I saying that correctly?
Right. Yeah. Keep in mind that what we're talking about are the toxins. These are chemicals that are produced from the mold. And once the chemical is there, in the pet food industry regarding like retort and extrusion, you're not gonna destroy those molecules very much. You might have a little bit of degradation, but not very much, and you sure can't count on that. And so it's not the mold after it becomes a toxin. So your retort, your extrusion, that'll kill the mold, but it has virtually no effect on the toxins themselves. So again, these are chemical tests. It's microbiological to grow, and you can kill that mold, but you're not going to do anything, or you'll do very little in regard to reduction of the actual toxin that's already been formed. They're very, very, very stable molecules.
Okay, so good to know. So it sounds to me that means that's why you need to keep testing in terms of the finished product. On the front end, when you're testing the raw materials, is there a recommended frequency, or does that depend on which materials you're using, where you're getting them from? What are
Absolutely.
the parameters there?
You need to do a full risk assessment on your individual ingredient. So like in our case, our business position is that if it's a risk, like corn, like aflatoxin in corn, you probably better test every load. It may be, even this year might be better than last year, but for certain things that are risk for aflatoxin, you probably better test every load. There are other things that, depending on the frequency and what your survey showed, keep in mind that your program should involve a very robust survey even before you start buying for the year, right? So you should have a good knowledge base of where these toxins are occurring out there in the agricultural field, and then the frequency and the levels of which you're going to see. But once you've identified it as a true risk, there's a good chance that you're going to want to test every load. If you don't see it as a risk up front, you still are going to want to test something at a certain frequency, just to make sure you're not going to pick something up from a storage condition, because it may have been perfect in the field, but then storage might be poor, and you might have picked something up in the storage. But like for me, aflatoxin on corn all the time, and Zerol known as well, also Dawn on corn every load, and wheat certainly Dawn every single load, and there's several like that should be one-to-one testing if that risk has been identified.
Right, and
Where,
then
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, based upon levels of those toxins that we are seeing then in the corn crop specifically, then for me, that would increase testing frequency, into some corn byproducts that are coming in depending upon what we're finding in corn. So if it's a really clean year in corn, then a more survey approach, to the corn byproducts, might be applicable. But as we see AFLA or DON or Phamatoxin, especially AFLA and zearalenone creep up in the corn, it becomes that much more critical to increase our testing frequency in those commodities as well, just because the process of producing those concentrates the toxins. So you'll see a higher toxic load in those materials than you would into the corn that originally went in it, just from the manufacturing process that's associated with it.
Yeah, anywhere from 3 to 5x.
Yeah.
From corn to corn gluten meal. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, we've had a question come in about corn gluten meal, but first, you both have mentioned, keeping do a survey of what's known at the time. If it's, what are certain risks where you are, what are good resources for people to find that information? I know I see them all the time. I get emails from various companies that, or like Romer are involved in mycotoxin testing and mitigation. Is there any one source that makes sense? Does FDA track
Right.
that, or do you recommend
Right.
trying the manufacturers?
I mean, several manufacturers put out kind of mycotoxin crop blast, on predefined schedules as we move through crop harvest. So you'll get some information, either what we're hearing from our customers or what we're seeing internally analytically. Unfortunately, Randy might know more sources, but for me, some of the best information about the crop comes out after the harvest is complete. So, it's kind of that retrospective look back at, hey, let's, we've analyzed 1,500 samples. Let's take a deep dive into the data, or, really dig into let me look at this state versus that state, things such as that. And, we put out information after the harvest. I know competitors in the test kit industry do as well. The FDA has a summary report that comes out every year after it as well, kind of looking back. So there is information available, and if it's not applicable, maybe real time, because it's always post-harvest, at least it can be used as a guide to what's expected. I know, talking just about the FDA report, they've been doing a study since 2011. So they do a similar study every year. So at least you have a year over year kind of starting point, a regionalized, approach to start with from the data.
Yeah, and it's so weather based in regard to what toxins are going to be where and in which crops. So there's a huge amount of work that's been done over the past few years on predictive modeling. But to Christy's point, still pre-harvest, it is just predictive. So you still need to be doing your actual, pre-screening before you start making those large purchases, across the whole U.S. or wherever you might buy those grains from. But those models are getting better and better and better. So, going forward, I think those are going to be extremely valuable tools to use. You can always contact, like if you buy primarily local, you can contact your local agricultural extension offices. USDA puts out reports, and FDA, and so on and so on. Academia, if you're in an area where you have a good agricultural science university, they'll track these things as well.
Great. Okay. So you mentioned gluten meal. I think one of you did. I'm sorry, but this kind of goes back to the whole rapid test, using rapid tests on raw materials coming in. This person mentions that they manage gluten meal for a major processor, and they found the most prevalent rapid tests typically show results higher than actual when submitted for third-party testing. And then, so pet food companies may end up with rejections they end up paying for, but it could be based on bad testing. Is that prevalent? Is there a way to get around that? I mean, you know, if people have concerns, do they just automatically send it for third-party reference testing?
Right. Corn gluten meal, corn gluten feed, DDGs, you know, they are, for lack of better words, a beast, you know, all their own in managing from a testing standpoint. So what makes rapid test kits difficult to analyze those materials is it's really at least a twofold topic. One, the industry, so pet food manufacturers, customers, you know, such as Randy and his company, desire water-based test kits, if possible, from an environmental employee hazard handling basis. So manufacturing of test kits that extract a sample using a water-based, water plus a buffer, has been kind of the push of the industry the last handful of years. Many mycotoxins, with the exception of DON, are not readily extracted in water. So the more complex the material gets, something such as corn gluten meal or corn gluten feed, you struggle to adequately get a good extraction out of that to analyze that on a test kit if you're doing a water-based test kit. So that's part of the struggle in trying to make an approach that fits you know, what the customers are most desiring. Along with that is when we talk rapid test kits, when we talk quantitation of a lateral flow device, we're calibrating those test kits based on a clean commodity such as corn or such as wheat. And then all commodities that you analyze on that kit are really judged against those calibrations for corn or against those calibrations for wheat. And again, that's all done in this water-based realm. So when you have a matrix that's dirtier, that might, you know, give more simply pigmentation to it, it doesn't behave fully correctly on that test kit. So that's where we start to see these swings in analytical data where they might be able to be used as a guide, but they're not precise enough in that capacity, you know, to use, you know, with true rigor. So until we get to back to maybe a solvent-based extraction on a rapid test kit for something as corn gluten meal, so going back to using ethanol or methanol, you know, something such as that, where the extraction efficiency is better, it allows us to pull the toxin out of that matrix easier. That combined with some better mechanisms of calibration from a production standpoint, you know, there's those sorts of things that would need improvement to really make the rapid test kits fit for those types of materials. So,
yeah, and one thing that's really important on whenever you're using the rapid kits at your inbound, part of your management program should include check samples, known naturally contaminated materials that you should be checking, whether it's once a day or every time you run it or once a shift. You need to be checking those test kits with a known amount of naturally contaminated material, like material, to make sure you are getting the actual efficiency that you should be. Otherwise, you could be really missing the boat regarding rapid testing. So that consistent and constant and robust proficiency testing has to be part of your management program at the factory level.
Okay. Does it matter? We've had a couple of questions related to this both beforehand and just now. Does it matter how the ingredients arrive? For example, a 50-pound bulk bag versus a truckload? Does that have any bearing on the use of testing for mycotoxins?
you know, it for me, it goes back to, you know, your own company's risk assessment. You know, what size is a lot to you? What size is a batch, you know, from raw materials to your finished product? You know, for reference point on sampling, it's an old study, but there was a very good study done by the Usda, I think back in the 1970s, that looked at sampling plans. I believe a guy's last name was Whitaker that worked on it at the time. You know, but they talked about, you know, the need to take, say, a 50,000 kg lot of something, from that lot pull you know, at a minimum 5 kg of sample from that, then that needs to all go through some type of mill for grinding that then can be subsampled until you really get down to an analytical portion that's about 100 grams. You know, so you're taking a 50,000 kg lot, pulling your multiple subsamples, eventually working your way down to 100 grams, because then the test kits that we use or reference methods use anywhere from a 10-gram sample to a 50-gram sample to analyze. So doing your due diligence to really sample thoroughly and sample well will lead to better monitoring of mycotoxins, you know, because even analytically, we don't want to underreport if there is truly mycotoxin there, give somebody the false perception that their commodity's clean because maybe we missed it in sampling. But at the same time, we don't want to hit the one hotspot where the toxin's concentrated and alert everybody that there's a mass issue when, again, we did an improper job of sampling, you know, to get the right result. So for me, the larger the lot that you're pulling from, the more diligent you have to be about the small replicates that you're pulling to make that initial sample that you're sending through for the grinding and the subsampling.
Yeah, all great points. And again, USDA has this whole handbook just on sampling that talks about all the different types of vessels that you would get in, like a flat bottom versus truck versus a rail car versus hopper bottom versus super sacks and so on. That guidebook that I just showed, again, it's a USDA guidebook, talks about all those things and how to sample, what your sample size should be. And then, of course, the sample prep is so important. I'll plug the Romer mill here because it grinds and splits the sample in one step. So, you know, all those things become highly critical in regard to any of these analyses.
Right. Because, you know, to kind of add in with that, to end that thought is, you know, mycotoxins are inherently non-homogeneous across any lot, you know, across any field, you know, even within a very small plot of ears of corn. You know, it's not that you'll get a truckload of corn in and every single kernel is going to have the same amount of aflatoxin in it. You know, you'll have some kernels that are clean, you'll have some that are more contaminated. So being that it presents in a very non-homogeneous nature, that's why we really have to do a due diligence to sample to try and get the real world picture of what's going on.
Probably the highest point of variability in the testing is that sampling and the sample prep.
Ah, okay.
Agreed.
Good to know. Good to know. For folks who may have come on a little bit later, the handbook, the USDA handbook that Randy held up, Sophie was very nice to put a URL in the chat box. So if you scroll up for that, you can see, and that also will include, we've had a few more questions come in about levels of mycotoxins that are allowed or recommended. One question related to that, is there any levels recommended and when there's more than one, could be more than one mycotoxin in a finished product? So for example, is there any kind of guidelines or knowledge about any kind of interaction if there's more than one mycotoxin?
There is knowledge. Yeah, there is knowledge about synergistic effects. One within the 6 main toxins that we've kind of talked about today. And if you have low levels of those, you know, synergistically, it becomes a method of addition as far as toxicity with the animal. But then aside from that, there's topics of masked mycotoxins. So either metabolites of the mycotoxins that we're really looking at, or different emerging mycotoxins that we get into that are becoming more prevalent or based upon, you know, some clinical studies or farm trials that we're starting to understand more toxicity of some toxins that we really didn't focus on, you know, years gone by. So there is a lot of attention spent on that synergistic, looking at, you know, the regulated type mycotoxins, the masked ones, the emerging ones, And then, you know, when you look at, you know, from a herd health or a pet health basis, you know, the closer to an analytical 0 we can get for all toxins is of course ideal, you know, but, you know, really there's a lot of work to do in it yet, you know, let me close that as well. So I think there's more understanding than there was 5, 7, 10 years ago, but it's not a clear picture yet. You know, there's hundreds of mycotoxins that are known, you know, that have been identified and purified. You know, we've talked about 6 on a routine basis in our lab. We test 18, and then we also have a method that looks at 54, you know, that we focus on with nutritionists and those most interested in a herd health kind of basis. So there's mycotoxins are known. It's a established industry, but there's still lots of unknowns, lots to learn. Yeah, with it.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any actual proposed levels for synergistic, you know, in the individual grains. But to Christy's point, that's coming. I can see that being proposed in the not too distant future, where they're going to, if you have a combination of aflavom and zearalenone, maybe the limits are going to be, you know, 5, 5, and 5. You know, who knows? But there is a significant amount of work being done in those areas right now. So hopefully we'll have clarity on those things in a few years. But whatever you do, don't tell your purchasing people that there's 54 mycotoxins.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there was a question just came in that we hadn't really addressed related to purchasing. You know, when you go farther upstream, so say the elevators, feed elevators and grain storage facilities, you know, where a lot of these common grains are purchased from, are they testing there?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So once corn is harvested and it's sold into the grain, really the movement of grain, either domestically or poised for export, it begins testing most heavily on the aflatoxin side. You know, that's where most of the focus is, but testing frequency ramps up on the others as well, kind of year after year based upon what we see. But as soon as it hit, you know, maybe not at the very small, you know, local kind of grain terminal that a farmer might sell into first, but definitely by the time it starts moving into those larger companies and getting into truck and river, you know, rail car movement, it's definitely tested by that point.
Yeah, those are difficult conversations to have upstream with your suppliers. You know, aflatoxin for sure. The last couple of years, they've heard about zearalenone and probably DON, but you know, when you get further away from those big companies, the knowledge base is pretty small. So do your part with your purchasing folks and collaborate with them and have those conversations and help those suppliers, because you'll be helping them with all of their customers, not just with you. But the more you can educate those folks upstream, the better off all of their customer base and the industry will be because of that.
Okay, good tip. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about the finished product testing, because we haven't really delved into that. Are there recommended frequency or other types of protocols to follow? Or again, is that just based on your own management and your own risk within your company?
Yeah, we have customers that certainly want finished product testing done on all of their runs, and then we have other customers that are satisfied with more or less the upstream management. So it just depends. But any management program should involve some level of finished product testing. Now, keep in mind, testing is only verification. Right? It is not mitigation. No amount of testing is mitigation. It just isn't. It's only verification of your upstream controls. So the frequency will depend on your risk, and like in my case, depends on to some degree on what customers expect.
Okay. And as you mentioned earlier, Randy, a question just came in. So even if, in most cases, the traditional pet food processing methods of extrusion or retort for wet foods, they might kill the mold if there was mold from mycotoxin, but if the mycotoxins are still present, they would still be present.
Right. Yeah, you'll kill the mold in your process, but you won't kill the toxin. You'll have very little, if any, effect on those toxic molecules. They're chemicals. They're not live.
Yep. And they are very chemically stable. So
Very
when they're in your finished product, there is nothing you are going to do to remove them. It is there.
Yep.
So that we've had quite a few questions about mitigation efforts. And I want to get into some specifics because folks has specifics. But so if a company does a test of a finished product lot and it's above acceptable levels or it's at harmful levels, that's pretty much means that's a wasted lot, correct?
Correct. And in some cases, if it's out in commerce already, you might have to go back and get it.
Get a recall.
Yeah. And if it's aflatoxin, you're expected to go get it, or you're in violation of the law.
Okay. So where would mitigation efforts happen? Would that be with the raw materials? If it's found?
So it's interesting, and probably there'll be some people on the call that agree and probably lots that don't. But mitigation is about the upstream knowledge, because testing doesn't mitigate, and that's the only tool that we have at the factory is testing, and that's not mitigating. So you have to do your homework. You have to you get these predictive models. You talk to your test kit suppliers because they'll have a knowledge base and so on like that. The mitigation, here's the one mitigation for mycotoxins: don't buy contaminated grain. That's the mitigation for mycotoxins.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Christy, were you going to add anything to that?
Right. No, just mostly just to add in that, there's the presence of mycotoxins is environmentally driven. There's very little direct human control at that point that can alter the outcome of the mycotoxins. If our predictive modeling and our weather patterns in the middle of 2022 show, for example, hey, the Midwest is going to have a horrific aflatoxin year, there's not things that we can then do to stop it. It's going to, we're really at the mercy of those environmental conditions, which makes the verification of what you're buying and you're testing year over year so critical. So of course, there's things that seed companies work on from a GMO perspective, to find ways to make grains more drought resistant or insect resistant, herbicide resistant, things like that reduce the pathways and the mechanisms for the mold infestation to begin, that may help slow the levels of mycotoxins that occur. But there's nothing at this current time that will prevent it. There's nothing we can do where 2022 we have a clean crop, that we're guaranteed mycotoxins are gone, sort of thing.
Yeah, correct.
So things that have been mentioned, like, can you use mycotoxin binders, or I think someone asked about bentonite. It seems like we had another question come in beforehand that asked about a specific method. Those really aren't worth pursuing. Is that essentially what you're saying?
You'll always get those questions, and that's a matter of your business perspective. The companies I've worked with, binders they're binders. That again, it's not a mitigation in any way, shape, or form, and we don't use them. Now maybe there's a case for binders in certain species, more in the swine industry and livestock industry, certainly are some application, but those are animals that get harvested, right? In a pet, what are the long-term effects of binders? So, I think most of the people on this call, they're gonna have that same point of view, and you're probably not going to want to use those.
Right.
Other species, sure, but those aren't mitigations. They're maskers.
Okay.
Right, because the feed, food would still potentially contain the mycotoxins.
Right.
The addition of the binder just prevents the animal from absorbing the toxin, as it progresses through their digestive system. So you're not eliminating the toxin from what they're consuming. You're just trying to manage the toxin's impact on their body.
Right. Some interesting questions just come in. Are there any methods that someone asked for, like color sorters? So, I mean, is there any way to add something to, say, the grain that would, show a presence of a mycotoxin via color?
Well, I think it's important to note that, the presence of visible mold on grain means it's probable that you would have mycotoxins there, but it doesn't mean you do, because you could just have mold and you could have absence of the toxin producing mechanism. At the same time, you can have beautiful, clean grain comes in and it can be full of toxin, just the physical or the visible mold is not there. So, we kind of have the saying, if you see the mold, it's probable, but absence of mold does not mean it's impossible. So it's still your due diligence and your testing.
Still the testing. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, Randy, were you going to add to that?
No, that I was disagreeing. Yeah.
Okay. Another question about the finished product. So the question is, even if the mold is killed, but say their mycotoxins still prevalent within the product, maybe at a very low level, a non-toxic level, would they increase over time in storage if they, during a product shelf life?
The toxins themselves will not increase once the mold is gone.
Okay. But they would have the potential of possibly creating mold later on if the correct conditions were right.
Right. If they got put back in bad storage conditions, yeah. If the mold is there, then like Christy said, the potential is there for the development. But once that mold is gone, then there is no more production of mycotoxins.
Right.
So that's why storage conditions are so important.
Correct. Okay. Okay. And someone asked too, what do you do with contaminated products or mold? I mean, for the most part, they're a loss, correct?
It depends. Like for aflatoxin, different species can take higher levels of the toxin legally.
Right.
Up to, I think it's probably 200 parts per billion on aflatoxin can go into cattle feed. So it depends on the species. So it's not necessarily lost, but in many cases it would be, you would have to dispose of it if it was really, really high, depending on the toxin, for sure.
Right. But yeah,
But
if the levels. Go ahead, Randy.
I was just going to say, it is species dependent on those.
Yeah, so if they're testing and determining those mycotoxin loads in the grain trade aspect yet, that's where it'll be diverted to different sources. Instead of the grain being headed for a pet food manufacturer, exactly like he's saying, it's going to be diverted and go for feedlot cattle, because they can handle more. But once it gets into a finished product basis, at that point, the regulation stays the same and there's not much you can do with it. So
understood. Yeah, we this past Pet Food Forum in September in Kansas City, we actually had a presentation from a company that is raising mealworms, possibly as a an insect, as a protein source for pets and other species, but also they're participating in a DARPA funded study where they're located next to a grain facility, and they're showing that the worms can eat the contaminated grain that's contaminated with mycotoxins without any ill effect on the worms, and without it like carrying over into the meal that is, or the oil or whatever that's made from the worm. So there's interesting things like that being looked at, but it's going to take a while. Well, with that, we're past our hour. Thanks to Christy and Randy for all the great information insights. I know I learned a lot today, so I'm hoping that everyone on the call did too. Thank you again to Romer Labs for their support. To continue your learning on many other pet food industry topics, please watch for more of these Ask the Pet Food Pro chats. We have a lot more coming in 2022. We have 2 events coming up in May, the live events, and there will also be on-demand versions. Pet Food Forum 2022 in early May in Kansas City, and then Pet Food Forum Europe later in May in Nuremberg, Germany, and that one will be co-located with InterZoo. So for more information on both of those, you can visit petfoodforumevents.com. Finally, just another reminder that this chat has been recorded and that will be available in about a week, also on petfoodforumevents.com under the ASAPRO chat tab. So thanks you again for logging in today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or evening. And thanks again to Randy and Christy.
Thank you for having us. Enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you.